Kia ora koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou, daja zao shung hao. And thank you, Fran, for that warm welcome. And good morning to all of you distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. There are many, of course, VIPs in this room, but I will make special mention of my colleague, the Honourable David Parker. If there are other members of Parliament in the room, I acknowledge you also. And I'm grateful for the invitation to be here today. You know, certainly a lot has happened since we all met here this time last year. And I will take a moment this morning to look back on the year, but I also want to talk a bit about what I see as some of the exciting opportunities ahead. And then, of course, I welcome the chance to take questions after my short address. Let me start, though, by acknowledging that it is not yet 2 months since the March 15th terrorist attack here in New Zealand. I've been extremely proud of the support that has flowed so freely from the whole of New Zealand, including New Zealand's Chinese community, to the people of Christchurch, and particularly those deeply affected by the attack, and for that I say thank you. We've also been honoured by a great deal of support from every corner of the world. Indeed, among the first messages of condolence I received were letters from Premier Li and President Xi, and I was pleased to be able to thank them personally for their messages during our discussions when I visited Beijing a month ago. Now, it's no secret, of course, as Fran has mentioned, that we had been planning a much longer and a much more elaborate visit to China last month. You saw what we could do in a day. You should have seen what we were going to do in 8. It was going to be quite the whirlwind. But under the circumstances, that was not possible, and nor was it appropriate. And our counterparts in China understood that completely, and for that we were very, very grateful. But I did want to take up the invitation from Premier Li to visit China because there is so much that we are doing together. And this is especially the case with New Zealand's business interests, but also with our cooperation in the region and increasingly on issues of global importance. It was important, therefore, for us to continue the momentum of discussions from earlier meetings. Now, I don't need to dwell too much around the context of the visit. You already know that China is one of our most important and far-reaching international relationships. China is a valued partner for New Zealand, but it was clear from my discussions with Premier Li and President Xi that China also values its relationship with New Zealand. It is now more than 47 years since New Zealand officially recognised the People's Republic of China and instituted our One China policy, which remains firmly in place today. But foreign policy is dynamic, and relationships should never be taken for granted. And so a key focus of my meeting with Premier Li was reiterating our shared commitment to the comprehensive strategic partnership between our two countries. We also discussed the importance of the economic relationship between New Zealand and China and the ways that it can be strengthened. Now, I don't need to tell this audience that the New Zealand-China Free Trade Agreement has significantly benefited both countries. China is now our largest trading partner, and two-way trade recently exceeded $30 billion for the first time, a significant milestone in the trading relationship. Premier Li and I discussed the FTA upgrade and agreed to make joint efforts towards reaching an agreement as soon as possible. I know Minister Parker will have more to say on this and on the opportunities for New Zealand from China's Belt and Road Initiative when he talks to you later this morning, especially off the back of his recent trade mission where he attended the Belt and Road Forum. You'll also be aware that government has begun consultation on proposed options to reform New Zealand's Overseas Investment Act. The reform options are focused on achieving a balance between supporting overseas investment, improving the process for investors, and cutting unnecessary red tape while ensuring investments are in New Zealand's national interest. During my visit, I reiterated to Premier Li that New Zealand welcomes all high-quality foreign investment that will bring productive economic growth to our country. And again, it was another opportunity to make clear that any changed rules will be applied with an even hand and that all potential overseas investors will be on a level playing field with no discrimination applied against any specific countries. I believe this message was well understood, well received, and of course are a set of principles that we apply not only in our investment approach, but in our foreign policy approach generally. New Zealand and China's cooperation is, however, growing across the board. In trade, yes, but in agriculture, science, innovation, education. In fact, at the same time that I was travelling to Beijing, China's Minister of Culture and Tourism was in Wellington, officially opening the 2019 New Zealand-China Year of Tourism with Tourism Minister Kelvin Davis. It was a subject matter, in fact, that I discussed informally with Premier Lee. He freely offered up his view that, in particular, Māori culture was an important part of our tourism offering and a significant factor for Chinese tourists. His personal interest, knowledge and appreciation was something that I thought was particularly noteworthy and was really a take-home for me from some of our informal discussions. The breadth of our relationship was also shown by the agreements that Premier Lee and I witnessed being signed on the 1st of April. Now, these included science and technology, a high-level memorandum of arrangement relating to science and research cooperation. Financial cooperation, a bilateral financial dialogue was established, and our double tax agreement updated. And agriculture, a 5-year agricultural cooperation program was also established. This breadth and diversity of cooperation is reflected in the fact that there are now 10 New Zealand government agencies representing your interests in China. I was also really pleased to be able to officially open our new embassy in Beijing during my visit. This new embassy is a focal point in New Zealand's engagement with China and an important avenue for the New Zealand government to support your businesses, your activities over there. The Chancery reflects us, New Zealanders, in its informality, its openness, its connection to the environment. I returned to the embassy several points during my visit and saw staff and visitors enjoying and utilising this space really successfully. Now, the fact that it is now one of the largest footprints and operations that we have offshore in the form of an embassy, I think speaks to the importance and the value of the relationship. It also speaks to the fact that it used to have a tennis court, which we, of course, have now built over and will be using in a much more efficient way, much to the lament of those who can remember its presence there once. Our cooperation with China also extends to the crucial international issues that will affect us, all of us, into the future. We look to cooperate with China to promote regional stability and development consistent with New Zealand's values of openness, transparency, and the rule of law. New Zealand has welcomed China's interest in greater engagement on international issues, and President Xi Jinping's commitment to protect the rules-based international order and play a stronger role in advocating for economic globalisation and open markets. Premier Lee and I considered how China and New Zealand can work together to support the multilateral trading system. In fact, that was a reasonable subject of conversation between us, and particularly the modernisation and improvement of the World Trade Organisation. It's an issue dear to Minister Parker's heart, which you may wish to discuss with him when he speaks with you later this morning. We also issued a joint statement that committed both our countries to work closer together to address the issues of climate change, both bilaterally and in multilateral forums. China's leadership on climate change will add essential momentum to our collective efforts, and we look forward to the third bilateral climate change dialogue, which is taking place in New Zealand later this year. Let me say here that environmental and climate change issues are not just nice to haves. They are at the forefront of our values as a country. They are also of vital concern to future generations and will strongly impact the quality, the cost, and the reputation of our export and service industries. Another core New Zealand principle, one that has been much discussed over the past year, is our independent foreign policy. We apply our sense of fairness and fair play to our foreign policy as well as our domestic policies. We make decisions based on what is in our best interests and consistent with our values. And we do this in accordance with the international rules-based system of laws and conventions upon which We all depend for our security and for the free flow of goods and services. Now, more than ever, we cannot take that for granted. Now, this means that we will work together with our international partners, including China, and with organisations such as the United Nations, the WTO or APEC, to try and find common solutions to global problems. It also means that from time to time, we will have points of agreement and points of divergence with our international partners, regardless of their relative size, history, or political system. And as you know, for example, there are the areas where we do not always see eye to eye with China, and there will be times when they do not always see eye to eye with New Zealand. This is only natural. But as long as we continue to have a relationship built on mutual respect and understanding, we can and we will discuss our differences in a mature and respectful manner. That's why a point I will continue to make is that any differences of perspectives, they do not define our relationship. Our positions on international issues, regional security, climate change, human rights, inclusive free trade, and therefore based on these principles, which we express consistently and respectfully to all our international community. And again, these are not just nice to haves. They're critical elements of who we are as a people and of our position and our reputation in the world. Let me wrap up by saying that I'm pleased to see the New Zealand-Chinese relationship is in good shape. Politically, we are in close touch. Economically, we are doing great things together, and our people-to-people links are growing day by day. And as I said at the beginning, China is a valued partner, and Premier Li and President Xi made it clear to me that China also values its relationship with New Zealand. But as I said here last year, it's not enough for me to just say this. It will take a continued focus from all of us involved on both sides for it to continue. Your discussions today and the business relationships that you forge are going to be critical. And I encourage you all, therefore, to make the most of this superb opportunity to continue to share your expertise, your experience, and your enthusiasm. Now, before I invite your questions, I'm going to do something unscripted, and that is congratulate Fran O'Sullivan for her recent receipt of an honours in the last New Year's honours list. Fran, I just want to recognise that that was obviously in recognition to your long service to journalism, but also the role that you've played in the critical relationship between the business community, New Zealand, and our relationship with China. So I wanted to acknowledge that, Fran. And again, I equally invite your questions and questions from the floor. Kia ora koutou katoa.
Thank you, Prime Minister. It's a bit hard to throw a curveball off the back of that one, I think. Sting really gone. Look, I do invite you all to submit questions, either through the process that Tim has outlined or by putting your hand up. And I'm sure, please do take great advantage of this period that the Prime Minister has made available to us. Just one thing I was going to just put to you, Prime Minister. We went through a period where questions were made and asked frequently by media about who just is in charge of New Zealand's foreign policy with China. I take it from what you've said today that you are firmly in control.
Oh, well, look, that's the convention, of course, of any government, that yes, of course, we have multiple players who play an incredibly important role in our foreign policy and our direction. You'll hear from our Minister for Trade and Export Growth just how critical his role is on the ground. Of course, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade, but ultimately the convention has and always will be that the Prime Minister is the office that ultimately leads foreign policy direction for any government.
And so, I mean, some criticism had come out of China quarters that perhaps some of the commentary and policy decisions might have been a little bit, not necessarily undisciplined, but could have been more accurately and foreshadowed with China ahead of happening. Do you think the commonality you've, I guess, addressed and forged in Beijing with the leaders will take you down that track in future?
I do think that we have a consistent position. Of course, you'll understand why I won't buy in necessarily to media rhetoric that suggests otherwise.
Okay. Questions from the floor? Do we have anyone? Could you please put up your hand?
It's what happens when you do things before people have eaten.
Okay, all right. So one of the things talking among business here is there is some concern that the recent FDI announced proposals for changes to the law might actually place a bit of a question mark as to what degree Chinese investment, and indeed all foreign investment, is welcome in New Zealand. I mean, is this something that is of concern to you, that we do actually hang out that shingle that we are open for business in the way that we have been?
Yeah, and I think this is where just that consistent contact, where we were able to, instead of just have the rhetoric played out around us, have a dialogue around what it is that we intend through those legislative reforms. To give you an example, for instance, of course, we were very clear about our policy rationale for the decisions we made on residential housing. That should not have been an indicator towards more broadly, however, that we were shutting down foreign direct investment, rather that we wanted to redirect FDI into the productive economy. And that investment in residential housing is not an example of investment in the productive economy. And I do think that's well understood. On the flip side, an example that the Minister for Trade and Export Growth might give, for instance, is that we've taken a different approach with forestry, where actually we do want to welcome that investment into that industry. So you'll see then that we're trying to really incentivise and disincentivise those areas where we see it being helpful and perhaps less productive. And I think, again, New Zealand is not alone in having those settings. And really what's unusual is the fact that those changes had not been made prior. For the second tranche of reforms, actually it's about making it easier when we do have that engagement with business who are wishing to invest in New Zealand, that where it is an investment in our productive economy, streamlining that process and making the engagement with the OIO that much easier.
And I'm sure that will be music to a lot of ears in this room. One of the things, if just looking back on how long, for instance, the FTA negotiations have been going on for the upgrade between China and New Zealand, a lot has happened in that time. There has been significant business changes, particularly in China. I wonder if there's room for, via your Prime Minister's Advisory Business Group or others, to actually look at whether we are addressing those real business issues that are now on the table. Some of them we'll touch on today, but there has been a big move to new platforms taking over, competition on technology, and I don't think where we sit on the FTA talks really actually addresses some of that.
And you raise this is actually, I think, a challenge for the trade and export growth portfolio generally, and probably actually for all trade agreements to be dynamic. And of course, you're right. You know, agreements reached 10 years ago don't necessarily take into account some of the movement in the way that we trade and do business, particularly in the digital space. Again, that's something that Minister Parker's been looking at with some of our specific agreements, and I'm not entirely sure whether we're in a position to start talking about some of the extra work that he's been doing off the back of that need to make sure that we're continually adapting and modernising. I haven't actually asked the Business Advisory Council to look directly at some of the areas of the upgrade. Chris was smiling at me like, don't expand our agenda again. But maybe that is something that we could have a conversation about. It is fair to say, though, that, and those, I'm glad you raised it, the upgrade negotiations are underway this week again. So another round, so very active. And we are, a reasonable way down the track. We are in quite an industry-specific phase, I would say. So whether or not we're in a position now to start doing some of that work, that's probably a question for Minister Parker, but it's an absolutely fair point.
Some of the aspects that came up on Minister Parker's mission, certainly among the trade delegates, business delegates, was not just the pace of the change and the need for New Zealand business to hustle hard, and that's a business challenge, but some of the new, schemes that have been put on the table, like Alibaba, for instance, with the logistics hub here. And the question around this, should we actually have this being unipolar, as in other words with China, or should there be competition? Is there a leadership role New Zealand can take by perhaps inviting the Amazons and others to also contend? Because these are obviously geopolitical issues that will go on out there anyway.
Yeah, an interesting point. Actually, just sorry if I could take us on a slightly different track off the back of what you've just said. It reminded me of one of the conversations I managed to have in that whirlwind day where we got together a few New Zealand businesses operating, some of which have been operating in China for a number of years. And they made two really important points, I think, that really stood out to me. This, as you raised, the issue of competition. When New Zealand, when we're thinking about going into the Chinese market, the view that was being fed back to me was that too often we see other business entities within New Zealand operating in the same space as our competition. And yet when you're entering a market as significant as China, that actually that's the market where what otherwise would be competitors within New Zealand should be areas of cooperation for those entities into the Chinese market. Now, I could probably rattle off a few areas where that would make a lot of sense, particularly where we're trading on New Zealand's brand, probably in the food and primary industries in particular. There's areas where we do it incredibly well. Kiwi fruit would be an example, and there's other areas, probably meat, where we could do a little bit better. And so that was a point, if I'm thinking from the New Zealand business perspective into China, which really resonated with me. So it's only been when those businesses have been on the ground, they've suddenly realised that it's not each other that we need to think about, but just the market more generally. And the second point was just the need to be incredibly agile, that the Chinese consumer market is changing constantly, and that every 5 years now, businesses over there are saying we're needing to change the way that we're operating within the market. And that some of those businesses fed back to me that the thing that had been key to their success was actually coming in and come in with your New Zealand philosophy, New Zealand reputation, your New Zealand product, but then really embedding yourself by working on the ground with those who knew the consumer market their best, finding partners on the ground within the Chinese market. So those were just a couple of things. Sorry, it's not a direct question to your Alibaba one, but things that really resonated with me.
It was a great sideways shift.
Well,
we'll come back on that one.
Might be useful, I thought, to those in the audience.
A practiced politician and leader. So, getting to some
I just
questions.
don't always have answers, though, that's all.
So, getting to some questions from the floor. Facing a room of New Zealand business, what is the one thing you would ask the room to be more ambitious or brave about when engaging with China?
Probably some of what I said in my last answer. If we are going to make a dent in particular areas in the Chinese market, we have to remove the hesitation around working with each other, I think. Collaborate and think about ourselves as New Zealand Inc. And that includes for a number of products and offerings. And also, I think acknowledging that New Zealand's brand cannot be underestimated, the importance of that brand, and I feel a personal responsibility to make sure that it remains a tradable brand. That means making sure we're true to our values on the environment, on trust, a trusted brand, because so many of our food producers rely on it, that we remain a respected entity with a trade with. So in part, we need to lead the charge on that as central government, and then that flows through the products that we trade as well.
A question from Mark Thomas. Prime Minister, do you have reservations about aspects of Belt and Road, in particular project quality and debt risks in developing countries?
Of course, Belt and Road really, for New Zealand, is about us to consider for ourselves rather than on behalf of other countries that are signatories. And so if I take the New Zealand perspective on Belt and Road, we've already have a memorandum of arrangement, and now it's about then looking at those areas where it's mutually beneficial, both for China and New Zealand, for us to take that agreement. I think actually the fact that we've taken a little bit of pause as we've worked to really flesh out that arrangement has been no bad thing, because Belt and Road has really evolved. You know, I think it started very much as a core strategic infrastructure program, and has really started to, I think, alter into even potentially service industries, and so on. And so one of the areas that I know the Minister of Trade and Export Growth has really started talking about is the fact that New Zealand has a real offering in the fact that we rank so highly in ease of doing business. And there's actually probably some intellectual heft and practice there that we could have as an offering in our engagement with China that might be part of where we go on Belt and Road. So the fact that we've given that little bit of pause has meant that I think there are now new and emerging opportunities that might not be the old infrastructure element, but equally are mutually beneficial.
Two final questions. One from Frankie Wong. What was the biggest takeaway from your trip to China?
Yeah, I mean, there was that confirmation for me of that existing relationship, which is historic and strong. The little tidbits I gave you around particularly Premier Lee's interest in our tourism industry and his knowledge based on visits several decades ago. But really the overarching takeaway for me was that there's been a lot of debate about whether or not New Zealand and China's relationship has changed. Our geopolitical environment as a international community has changed. Diplomacy has changed. Trade and the trade wars we're seeing around us have changed. And so New Zealand's actual fundamental operating principles around the way that we undertake foreign policy has not. Our principles of openness, transparency, rules-based order, utterly consistent. And in many ways, China's approach on many issues has been fairly consistent as well, but the environment we're operating in is very, very different. And so I don't think that we should have concern that our conversation continues to change in that environment. We have to have harder discussions now because as a globe, we're having to confront harder issues. So we shouldn't shy away from that. And so really that was the take home for me. We have a strong foundation. It is a dynamic and difficult environment, but as long as our fundamental foundation is good and we are respectful and open with one another, then I think we're moving forward on a good basis.
Just one final question, because you also have the culture and heritage portfolio. The role of film and the New Zealand story and Māoridom, how important is that to crafting our image and brand with China?
I think actually, I've always seen that as being fundamental. I hadn't expected to hear it so proactively raised during my bilateral discussions. In fact, Premier Lee said that he thinks it's one of the reasons why China will continue to see New Zealand as such an important tourism offering. It was unique to us and of such interest. And so that actually really did stand out to me from the visit. So that's something I've always inherently believed, but to hear it reaffirmed, I think, was really important. And on film, I was just speaking to a director filming here in New Zealand, set to deliver a film project filmed here by the end of the year, likely to premiere in Beijing in New Zealand at the same time. Again, I think we probably are not necessarily giving as much coverage in New Zealand to the importance of that now, that partnership in film. And how important I think it will be both for New Zealand and China going forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for giving your time this morning to open the China Business Summit. We've all enjoyed your address, plenty of food for thought. And can I ask you all to thank the Prime Minister in the usual way?
Thank you. Enjoy your day.